historians, Miss Melton is here to talk to you about Johnson's plan for Reconstruction. So first we're going to read from the Pearson and Scott Forsman textbooks for 4th grade, and then we'll narrow down some important points of Johnson's plan. So, like we talked about before in the last part of this section, after the Civil War, the South was in ruins. Several plans were created to help repair and rebuild the region. After President Lincoln's assassination, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. Johnson wanted to carry out Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, the rebuilding and healing of the country. However, Johnson lacked Lincoln's skill at dealing with people. He and Congress fought fiercely. Lincoln and Johnson wanted to pardon Southerners who swore loyalty to the United States and promised to obey the country's laws. They would also welcome states back into the Union if they outlawed slavery and asked to be let back in. Congress thought these plans were too gentle and felt that the South should be punished for having seceded. However, Congress did want to help newly freed African Americans called freedmen. I think it's important to note that Johnson started out by just wanting to carry out Lincoln's original plan of abolishing slavery, getting rid of the Confederacy government, and the states could join back the United States if they made a new plan following the federal law, and to not punish Southern leaders, but that if you were a Confederate leader, then you couldn't run for office in the new government. Let's look at another text that talks about Andrew Johnson's plan. A new president. After being shot, President Abraham Lincoln died in the early morning of April 15, 1865, in Washington, D.C. Until that time, no United States president had ever been assassinated. Assassination is the murder of a government or political leader. Lincoln's killer was John Wilkes Booth, a 26-year-old actor who supported the Confederacy. Federal troops found Booth in a Virginia barn where he was shot and killed after he refused to surrender. Others who took part in the assassination plan were also caught and later hanged. A funeral train carried President Lincoln's body to his hometown of Springfield, Illinois, where he was buried. People in New York City, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, and other cities paid their respects as the train passed through their communities. And you can see in this picture, people lined the streets when Lincoln's funeral train passed through New York City. Now, I think it's important to talk about his assassination and how many people were hurt and how many people played a role in the assassination plan, because that tells you how emotional everybody was. So when Andrew Johnson wanted to carry out Lincoln's plan, they were already very upset because Lincoln was assassinated. So Vice President Andrew Johnson became the new president. The former senator from Tennessee intended to carry out Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, the rebuilding and healing of the country after the war. One of the first steps toward Reconstruction was ending slavery throughout the nation. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery in the United States, took effect on December 18, 1865. Johnson also had a plan to readmit the former Confederate states into the Union. Each state had to form a new state government. It had to pledge to obey all federal laws and deal fairly with newly freed African Americans. By the end of 1865, President Johnson believed that Reconstruction was complete. Under Johnson's plan, though, the Southern states were free to pass laws called Black Codes. These laws denied African American men the right to vote or act as jurors on a trial. Black people also could not own guns, take certain jobs, or own land. African Americans who were out of work might be fined or arrested. The laws had the effect of making African Americans' life much the same as it had been under slavery. Many in Congress were angered by the Black Codes. They thought Johnson's Reconstruction plan was too easy on the South. The Republicans, who had won a majority in both houses of Congress, did not trust Johnson, who was a Southerner and had been a Democrat before becoming Lincoln's vice president. Members of Congress began developing a new plan of Reconstruction. President Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment and other Reconstruction laws. He believed the Reconstruction Acts were unlawful because they were passed without the representation of Southern states in Congress. He tried to block the passage of several laws that granted further rights to African Americans. Angry about Johnson's actions, the Republicans in Congress tried to remove him from office by impeachment. Impeachment is bringing of charges of wrongdoing against an elected official by the House of Representatives. If found guilty in a Senate trial, an impeached president is removed from office. Johnson avoided being removed from office by one vote in May 1868, but his ability to lead the nation was weakened. So now let's look at some important points of Johnson's plan. When Lincoln was assassinated, Vice President Andrew Johnson became president. It's important to note that he was a Southerner, a former slave owner. He had no college education, and he was hated by the radical Republicans who were controlling Congress at the time. What was Johnson's plan for Reconstruction? He advocated that states should nullify their secession acts, meaning they should say they are not part of Confederacy anymore. They need to abolish slavery, and they need to repudiate war debts, which means he would let go of the war debts and not have the Southern states pay them back. Johnson also allowed a black codes to happen. Because Abraham Lincoln was assassinated or killed for political reason by John Wilkes Booth 5 days after the end of the Civil War. This caused these things to happen. Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, became president. Johnson did not push for new leaders in the South, so the same ones ended up remaining in place. President Johnson did not work to protect freedmen, and Johnson was impeached by the House of Representatives but not removed from office by the Senate. So even though he said that Confederate leaders could not hold office, he didn't really enforce it, which is part of the president's job. States were required to write new constitution pledging their commitment to the Union. Southern states did not feel that former slaves should be equal to whites, so they created black codes to control what African Americans could and could not do. So black codes at the time, those were laws passed in the South that limited the rights of former slaves, and it differed from state to state. For example, former slaves were not allowed to vote or own certain kinds of property or even work in certain businesses. Johnson wanted to revolutionize Southern society by breaking up the social and financial hierarchy. People who owned property worth $20,000 or more were disenfranchised, which means they lost their rights as citizens, such as the right to vote. Their property was also liable to be compensated. So he thought the plantation owners were making too much money, so he wanted to break that up, and if you own that much, then you couldn't hold vote, and you also probably would get your property taken. So, what ended up happening? Congress was adjourned, and Johnson put his plan into action. The Southern states agreed to his plan, except South Carolina, and the 13th Amendment was ratified. The Southern states reestablished their own civil government. As the government got back on their feet, they made some decisions that caused big problems. Jim Crow laws, also known as the Black Codes. African Americans were denied the right to work as free laborers. Most civil and political rights enjoyed by whites were denied to blacks. Race relations between whites and African Americans went downhill fast. Johnson opted to keep the congressmen from the southern states even though they were mad about being disenfranchised. So when Congress came back in December 1865, the other representatives refused to seat the Southerners. Johnson was really angry. He publicly attacked Republican leaders and vetoed the Reconstruction measure that Congress proposed, all because he had made laws and let Southern states do certain things without letting Congress know. So Congress didn't want the Southerners in Congress yet and thought that he went behind their back. So that's why he was really angry. So any legislation Congress started, he vetoed it. Learn more about Congress's plan next.